And so I
Mm,
think going in, there's going to be these challenges. You feel really optimistic about this big business plan that you have when in reality, your business plan is pretty much just like the documented version of the first plan that's going to break. Like, look at your business plan and then kind of just say, like, especially if you've never started a business before, it's like, okay, here's a great example of how things are not going to go.
Well, welcome to another episode of Navigation and Discovery with Cameron Singh. On today's episode, we have a great friend of mine, Seth Silvers. He is a local entrepreneur in northern Colorado and owner of a podcast agency. And we are going to dive into Seth's journey of becoming an entrepreneur and how he found that podcasting was going to be his business venture. And we go through all the challenges that he's had, all the great strides that he's been able to make. And I ran into Seth through mutual contacts within the local area and realized that he was an expert in podcasting, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so he's become a great friend, and you're going to learn really the heart behind an entrepreneur and the mindset behind an entrepreneur, the challenges, the strides. And so I really hope that you enjoy this podcast interview if you are an aspiring entrepreneur or an entrepreneur that is looking for some inspiration. So I really hope that you're able to learn from Seth's story and also the value of podcasting as well. I found a lot of value not only with this podcast, but other podcasts. And I really hope that you find some value in it and maybe even start exploring the opportunity to start your own podcast, hopefully. So I hope you enjoy this podcast interview with Seth Silvers. Well, thank you so much, Seth, for being on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So Seth, it's been really good just knowing you and getting introduced to you and learning more about the work that you do as an entrepreneur. And so that's where I really wanted to start off our conversation about your journey of entrepreneurship. And where I really wanted to start out is you do work in the podcasting world. And so I wanted to start off by asking, like, how did you get interested in podcasting? What sparked your interest of even just being involved in this podcast space?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting because I've my marketing company's been open for 8 years, about 8.5. So I started in 2015, but I actually didn't start exclusively focusing on podcasting until the last 3 or 4 years. And so there's kind of a lot of journey in between there. But when I started the company, I knew that my passion and kind of even a sense of calling was to help kind of small businesses and really help like impact driven businesses market through storytelling. I felt like there was this, I've always kind of felt like uh, equally disgusted and inspired by marketing. Like I hate what marketing is, but I love what it could be. Like I love it when it's done right and when it's done around stories. Um, and so when I started the company, I wasn't even thinking about podcasting. I was thinking about like video and social media and blogs. And so we did a ton of different content marketing. Podcasting wasn't even on my radar. I wish it would have been in 2015. But I think that sometimes it's not like looking back, it's just how things are supposed to go. And so I started the Small Business Storytellers in 2019. And my motive wasn't even like, oh, I'm going to bring in new business. I just knew a bunch of business owners and entrepreneurs around our local community in Fort Collins that I wanted to tell their story with. And so it was just like, man, this is going to be a great tool for me to get to tell their story and get their story out there. And I loved it. I loved the medium. I realized that I felt a lot more comfortable in podcasting than other forms of content. And we also started to see some really positive benefits to our business that I wasn't expecting. And so then, kind of long story short, that we can go into in whatever way you want. We started doing a couple other podcasts for clients or for other people that needed some help. And then came to kind of a fork in the road where I really needed to make some big decisions for Story On. And I'd been afraid to focus and to niche down and had kind of thought that I was going to be the exception, that I'd be able to serve everybody. And in that moment, I remember talking with my wife and being like, all right, we had actually just signed to build a house. And then we had just lost a huge client. And so it was like, okay, so because we're building the house, we have 6 months to like figure out the financial situation, to like get back on track from losing this big client. So it was like, for the next 4 months, I'm going to say no to everything else other than helping businesses launch podcasts. And if we don't get to these numbers, then I'll go out and find a job. Um, and that was about 3.5 years ago. And I wouldn't say the rest is history, but it's been
Yeah.
uphill from there.
Yeah, so I didn't what I didn't realize is that you started Story on well beyond the just focusing on podcasts. And so I wanted to go back to that kind of your story of starting Story on is like at what point, like take us back a little bit. At one point did you determine that you wanted to start something of your own, such as starting this marketing company?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely pieces like now that I'm looking back in my story into childhood and things that like I start to see like, oh, there's these inklings of things. And there's these stories where I started to really learn about entrepreneurship. And didn't necessarily know what to call it. And so I think looking back at how I grew up, it makes perfect sense. Like I can see the through line. um I s- I was more involved with the nonprofit space and with
Mm,
ministries, and so I was working for a ministry, um and had kind of been wondering in the back of my mind since college, like, what is the best way, like, is it possible for businesses to grow through storytelling? Like, is it possible for storytelling to actually be a marketing strategy that makes sense? And I'd kind of just been wondering this and like thinking about it, and I'd notice examples here and there, and I'd notice, kind of take note of them, and I'd write down different ideas. And I was doing this while I was finishing college, and then for about 2 years while I was the marketing director for a nonprofit where I was working with some of our good friends, Josh and Jonathan McGinley. So we were all working together, and there was this. Uh, I kind of formed a business plan. I had like formed it, and I hadn't shared it with very many people, maybe like three or four friends. But I'd like kind of written it out in a notebook. And I remember there was this pitch competition in Denver. I don't even know how I heard about it. But I was talking with a friend, and I shared with him the idea, and he was just like, "Man, I'm not happy in my job." He's like, if you started that today, I would quit and go in with you on it." And so I was like, "Wow, that's super interesting that like other people resonate with this." And so we decided to go down and pitch the idea. Not We weren't pitching to like get investors. It was kind of just like a feedback thing. And so it was this interesting style of presentation where you have 5 minutes, and every 20 seconds your slide automatically advances. And so it's kind of this forced rhythm. And we put together a presentation. We shared the concept with a group of, I don't know, probably 50 to 70 strangers. And we got incredible feedback. Like everybody was super stoked about it, and they were asking questions. So we were like, okay, this is really interesting. And then I talked with one of my business mentors and told him what I was thinking, and that I was kind of thinking about transitioning out of this nonprofit. And he owned a oil pipeline company at the time. And he was like, well, we've been looking to do some stuff like this. Like, we've been looking to get more involved with philanthropy and marketing and different things. And so he's like, if you end up making that jump, I'll be your first customer. And so I was like, okay, this is great. So then I talked to the nonprofit I was with, and we ended up putting together kind of a phase out plan. And so I transitioned out of that for about 6 months and worked part time for the organization while I was able to kind of work on setting up the business, kind of getting some of our first initial clients. And this was all back in 2015. And so I think there was a point where I knew, and I remember thinking about it. I was like, I don't know everything there is to know about running an agency. I don't know how to get clients. I don't know how to do a ton of things. But I was like, I'm to the place now where I know it's inevitable. Like, I'm going to start something, and I know that I at least have to try. And so once I got to that place, for me, it was like, I just need to start learning as soon as possible. Like, there's not going to be a ton of benefit for me in waiting a year and starting in a year. Like, I'd rather start now, even if the next year is filled with failure, and then in a year I'll be in a better place. So for me, once I kind of knew like this is going to happen at some point, then it was like this might as well happen now because I just want to start learning as quickly as I can.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to know is you had this idea, you started getting a few clients, you started putting a plan together, but of course, and I've heard this from a lot of those big entrepreneurs out there, that's this getting things off the ground is not easy. It's you're putting in more hours than ever. You're trying to figure things out. Hopefully you have the right people surrounding you in pursuing this new venture. So what were some of the challenges of starting out this business and also really on your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is you just don't know what you don't know. And so I
Mm,
think going in, you know, there's going to be these challenges. You know, you feel really optimistic about this big business plan that you have when in reality, your business plan is pretty much just like the documented version of the first plan that's going to break. Like, look at your business plan and then kind of just say, like, especially if you've never started a business before, it's like, okay, here's a great example of how things are not going to go. That doesn't mean we shouldn't plan and that we shouldn't go into that, but it's just things change. And so
mhm,
I think there was just so much that I didn't know. Um, that partnership starting, I started with a good friend. A year in, we realized this partnership isn't working. So that was a challenge. And I think in that first year, there were some things that I had delegated to my partner of like, okay, these are the things that you oversee. I was the CEO. And there were several elements where I like I think we need to trust, but I kind of like over trusted. So there were things that once he left that I was totally ignorant of. That it was like, man, I had no idea these elements that were going on. And so I really realized that even if I'm delegating and empowering and trusting, like it's still my responsibility as the business owner to know and understand and have an understanding of what's going on in the business. So I think that was a big thing. That was a big challenge. Was just learning that aspect and working through like transitioning from a partnership to it just being me. That was for sure a challenge. And I think that the finance side of things, I think I've always felt like it's a me not coming from a traditional agency world is a challenge and it's a strength because I there's a lot of things that happen in the agency world or like overcharging or different things like that that I see from my perspective. I'm just like, this is ridiculous.
mhm.
But then also, there's been a lot of times where I haven't known what to charge. Like that's been a really challenging thing. So I think for me, the biggest challenges have probably been in regards to like finances and numbers and understanding that. And then also just like believing in the value that I have. Like that gets me stuck often. And I think a lot of our challenges stem back to like, man, do we truly believe in the value that we're delivering, and are we bringing that to the market confidently? And kind of, it sounds silly with some of the projects we've worked on, and I just have to remind myself of that. But at the end of the day, like it's still really hard to believe in ourselves. Like that, I think that's harder than knowing the numbers. That's harder than coming up with what product you're going to sell.
Yeah, you make a good point on value because I have a really good mentor here locally that is always emphasizing on that is like you need to value, you need to provide, you need to believe in yourself first that you are of great value and that the product or service that you're offering is of great value so that when it's time to go sell or do the work that um you're showing that you believe in yourself and you value what you're providing so that your prospective client is going to value that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the flip side of
Yeah.
like the data where like if somebody doesn't value what you're doing, but you're like you believe in it to the end, then like there's a disconnect there that's really important to lean into. Where it's like,
Mhm.
why is there this disconnect? Like, am I overvaluing something that's actually not valuable to my audience? Um, so I think it's interesting too, because sometimes when there's a mismatch in value, sometimes that comes from somebody being like, man, this is so valuable. Like somebody says yes to your product right away.
Yeah.
Like first time you talk with them, they're like, great, sign me up for that price. And then it's like, huh, I think they're valuing this more than I am.
Yeah.
Uh, but then on the flip side too, if your customers are leaving and you can't keep customers, then the work you're doing is not valuable enough for them, or you're selling it to the wrong customer. So I think there's a lot around that value side that's really important to look at.
Hmm. I wanted to touch a little bit on your journey with making a shift in your company when you started to make that shift from I would call it marketing to podcasting. And I think a lot of people struggle with this, and I had struggled with this too. Is making a shift because initially starting your business, you have this vision of what you want to do, but then you realize you are going into something that you may have not been prepared for. or that may have not even been in your plan. So, talk a little bit about how you went from a marketing company to now focusing on podcasting for businesses.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And like I said earlier, I definitely did not really have podcasting on the radar. And I'll actually I have two books here that are really interesting because I read these two books in college. One is called True Faced, and I remember going through some challenges in college and really like I needed to reshape my understanding of pain and of sin and of even the church in some ways.
Hmm.
And through some trauma I was going through, this book really changed a lot of things. I haven't thought about this book. I've thought about what's in the book. I've not thought about this particular book in probably 13 years. This book, Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Pat Lencioni, a little bit better known. This was the first book I read in a business class. And so I remember both of these books. And now we're like working on podcast strategies for both of these authors. These books that like changed my life in college. I didn't even know what a podcast was in college. Um, Pretty much nobody did 13 years ago. So it's
Yeah.
so interesting that like we just don't know what's coming.
Yeah.
I remember the first podcast listening. It's weird the moments that stick out and now looking back at why they stick out. But I remember being in my friend's living room and talking to her brother. And her brother was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm listening to this podcast by this guy named John Lee Dumas. He just started this daily podcast called Entrepreneur on Fire." I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I remember listening to a podcast episode, and I think it had something to do with like a pig farmer. Like I remember listening to that. And I think that was the first time I listened to a podcast. Um, and then since then I've gotten to know John Lee Dumas well, and again it comes full circle. So there's these moments where then you don't realize what you're going to be stumbling into. I had a huge resistance to focusing and niching down for the first 5 years of my business because I wanted to help everybody. Uh,
Yeah.
and even for the first couple of years of podcasting, I still had the same struggle. But I wanted to help everybody. And I felt like I was niched down enough by helping small businesses with storytelling. Um, and so we started doing the podcast thing, started our own podcast, started working with a couple others. And for me, I just began to see that podcasting was really, really unique. If this is a weekly show and you have somebody that listens, let's say they listen to half of your episodes in the next year, they're probably going to spend over 20 hours with you, like in their head in the next year. My guess is there's probably not more than 10 people in your life that over the next year that you will spend 20 hours of like concentrated time in quality conversation with. And so I began to realize like, wow, this medium is really, really unique. And so I felt like for the first 5 years of business, our we knew our passion of like small businesses and storytelling, but I feel like I wasn't finding the right medium, or at least the right medium for me. Like we were struggling in aspects of video. Like there were things I liked and didn't like about blogging, and social media obviously has its challenges. And so I just felt like we hadn't like found the right like channel to really focus on building marketing strategies focused on storytelling. And so I think for me, a lot of it was when we started doing podcasts, I started to realize this medium is different. This is unique, and it's really unique when it's done well by businesses. It's really gross when it's done poorly by businesses, which is like marketers ruin everything is something that a lot of people say, and it's true. Marketers come in and kind of ruin a lot of things. So for me, I was beginning to understand that the medium of podcasting was unique in that it built a higher level of trust. And so I was really beginning to like it. And then, like I said, I kind of had this moment where things were at a pretty tight place financially with the business. And I was kind of just at the end of the rope where I had to be honest and be like, things have not worked. I'm 5 years into this journey, and sure, there's things I've learned. Sure, I've made some money, like we've provided for ourselves, which has been great. Like, sure, there's some clients that are happy, but the reality is this is not working. Like, I have not created a business. I've created a job where I work for more money, or I work more hours for less money than I could going. Like, my life would be much easier if I was working for somebody else right now. And so as my wife and I talked about it, I had to kind of come to grips with realizing this isn't working. And so kind of the last step for me before being willing to give it all up and being willing to close it down was realizing I have to focus. I have to try. That's the one thing I haven't tried. I haven't tried actually focusing and saying no to other projects. And so I just looked at the clients we were serving and I said, who's the happiest? What work brings the most joy to us and who's been paying us the longest. And it was our podcasting clients. And so I was like, all right, we're going to shut everything else down other than our podcasting clients. And for the next 4 to 6 months, I'm just going to get as many, at the time it was, I'm going to help as many coaches and consultants launch and grow their podcasts as I possibly can. Um, so that was really the moment, was being honest and realizing this isn't working, and having to look in and realize what should I be focusing on, and then kind of putting everything into that and being willing to say no to a lot of other things.
Mm. Um, Looking back, what are some of the things you wish you would have known or done differently in your journey so far in the entrepreneur
Yeah,
journey?
so many things. I know some people say like don't have regrets, and I don't know. I think I don't look back at lessons and be like, oh man, I don't beat myself up about it, but I recognize like, well, of course, like
Yeah.
there's a million different things I would do if I could go back with my current knowledge. I think a few that stand out really simply, that are really obvious ones, is one with the partnership. Like we got our partnership in writing, but we didn't get our expectations for that first year of our roles in writing. And so we were in a position where our partner at the time, he was willing to work, quite a bit of hours a week and had the stability to be able to do that for free. And so we said, all right. And he was like, I'm going to work for free for the first year. So we didn't get that in writing and those expectations. And so then it sounded good. It worked good at first, but then as the business didn't grow as quickly as we thought, that turned into a little bit of a challenge. And having things in writing would have made it easier for us to be able to like navigate a mismatch in expectations, and being able to sit down and just say like, hey, here's what we agreed to. Like, let's talk about this. It would have made that process a little bit smoother, even though it was a fairly smooth process. So I think that's one thing that if I'm in a partnership again, like those expectations will be really clear. I think another thing is just the finances of it, like putting more work earlier into knowing the finances, and trusting in them too. Like trusting, as I'm learning from other people that have gone before me that are teaching me how to price things, trusting them, trusting their experience. Probably the most transformative book for my business was the book Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. Completely transformed, getting our business out of debt, getting us to a place where every single month we're running profitably. Um, Even if we're growing slowly, being confident in the growth, that the growth we're doing is stable. So that's like one lesson that once I started digging in and actually understanding the numbers and the finances of the business, and understanding like margins for different clients and actually having data to support why we're pricing the way that we are. Um, that gave me such a confidence in the business that then I felt like I could actually go out and sell it. I could go out and sell our services better because I knew that I could trust that like the business wasn't broken on the back end. So I would just dive into learning the finances of it earlier. Um, that's kind of the main thing that when I look back and think of like, man, if I could do like one thing earlier, it would be, like just kind of understanding finances and recognizing that sales doesn't solve things. Like more cash isn't going to solve your problems. It's actually probably going to expose them. And I think for a while I was just like avoiding challenges in the business or problems in the business, and I was always just thinking like, oh, I'll just get a big client next month. Like if I just
Mm.
get one big client, then I can fix this. If I get
Yeah.
one big client, I can pay off the credit card bill. If I get one big client, I can do this. I can do this. Rather than like working into understanding the operations and the finances and like how the business actually operates. Uh,
Mm.
so those are some things that stand out for me.
Awesome. Well, it's been nice to hear your journey, especially kind of from the idea to you starting the business, evolving into now helping manage and start podcasts for business leaders. We live in a society today where I think there's a transition where I think people are getting tired of that typical like 9 to 5. Not everyone, this is not for everyone, but I would say there are a group of people or a percentage of society that is tired of that typical 9 to 5 life, and they have this idea that's like as small as a mustard seed, right? They want to start a business. They have this business idea that they're just thinking about every day, thinking about, one day I want to start my own business, do it in whatever that might be, because that's what they truly enjoy. But even myself, I struggled with taking action. And I know that was a challenge for you as well. But what advice would you provide to those listening that have that idea and they just have not taken action?
It's a hard place to be in. I think I think back to a conversation I had with one of our clients, and they started a show with their son, and their son was in college at the time, and he told his dad, he said, I feel like I could, he said, I feel like I could give a TED talk. Like I could give a good TED talk, but I haven't actually lived it out. And he was kind of alluding to like all of this information that we're hearing and all of this inspiration. And I've heard some people kind of a little bit crassly refer to it as like a lot of the content online as like mental masturbation, where we see all this content, we see all these ideas,
Yeah.
and it's like satisfying our brain by like feeding into them. And I think I fall into that sometimes too, where like one of my like weaknesses and one of my escapes is wanting to consume content in order to like find the secret. And I've like kind of diagnosed this in my mind of like I like go into content sometimes looking for like what's like the one, if I can just find like one thing that'll change everything in my business. And in reality, like we just need to start moving and start acting. From a young age, I've always kind of been willing to put myself in what I call like a position of like a place of no return. And usually that happens by telling other people about it. So a downside to my personality is I care way too much about what you think about me. Um,
Mm,
and I'm continually navigating this and praying through this and trying to understand like, man, I love bringing people together. I love working with people, but the downside of that is I care way too much about what people think. So for me, actually, one thing that's very helpful is if I tell people about what I'm going to do, it really, I don't want to let them down. And so for me, that's one thing that's always been helpful. I remember, starting a nonprofit when I was 16 years old in high school. And I still very vividly remember the moment that it felt real was when I invited like 15 of my friends over to my parents' house. Jonathan and Josh were in the room. And we got into this room, and I pitched the vision for what I was going to start in this nonprofit that we were going to start that was going to serve youth all across northern Colorado. And I remember like that was the moment that it was real because there was people in the room that one were like, okay, what can we do to help? Like, let's do this together. And there's been other moments throughout my journey where talking to people about it and getting it out of my head, getting the ideas out of my journal and actually bringing it to people, I think is one of the first things that we can do. And then I do think that most people would actually, and this is counterproductive because I'm in the content world. I
mhm,
think most people would actually benefit from watching less content on like how to start things. I think there's so much content. There's so much crappy content also, but there's so much content out there that people are consuming when they're trying to figure out how do we start, what's the first step? And we want to have the entire plan out before we take the first step. And I just don't think that that's beneficial. And I think that like 80 or 90% good and like out in the world is way better than 100% perfect and stuck in our head. And so
mm,
I think like we have to just be willing to like tell people around us about what we're wanting to do, get feedback on it, and just figure out how can we start moving.
mm,
Everybody's journey isn't, hey, quit your job and go full time into your business. There's a lot of different paths that people can take. And so I encourage people that are wanting to start something or they're thinking about it, like recognize the path that works best for you. Um, It's going to be different than everybody else is. And just because Joe Schmo down the street quit his job and went all in and was really successful and built $1 million business in the first year, and he looks perfect on Instagram, just because that's what he's saying doesn't mean that's the right journey for you. You might realize he's spending $999,000 in advertising to get $1 million in revenue. You just
Mhm.
don't know somebody's story. And so I would say tell people about it, bring other people into the conversation, and then just start from where you're at and commit to getting better along the way.
Yeah, that's so true because I know even I struggle with this today is you look at what other people are doing, what other people are doing in their businesses and have these nice stories. And you're like, oh, I just want to be like that. But then you have to, it's more of a mindset shift. Like, hey, no, I have to do it my own way and what works for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's challenging. There was just a couple weeks ago, I was with two friends at a dinner in Orlando, and they're sitting on both sides of me, and both of them are have other businesses connected to the podcast industry.
Hmm.
And in 2022, both of their businesses they scaled crazy. They scaled super fast. Both of their businesses were 4 times the size of mine in that year, and so like pretty prominent businesses. And both of them kind of crashed and burned because they were a lot better at selling than they were at the services. And so they brought all these new clients in, brought all this new staff in, and then they couldn't deliver on the back end to the
Mm,
level of quality that people were expecting. And then they both businesses kind of like had to really, really scale back. And I'm listening to both of them talk to me about how they both had to lay off like 10 to 15 people, and it took them like a year to like emotionally recover from having to like hire these people and then lay them off and kind of crush their dreams and all this stuff. So yeah, you just never know somebody's story, and you can see these things that look really good, but
yeah.
on the back end, like there's a business owner who's trying to do their best, but they're also probably failing and they're learning. And that's going to be true of me in our journey as well. Is there's always going to be things that we're struggling through and working through, but everybody's journey is very different.
Mm. I'd like to, and I know we talked about this before, but owning a business and also being a CEO and having oversight of a team, that's a not only a huge time commitment, but it also comes with a huge burden on your shoulders. Um, One of the things I like talking about is work-life balance or life-work balance, however you see that. So how is it that you, as a business owner, entrepreneur, CEO, find that work-life balance and manage that balance for yourself?
It certainly is a challenge, and I've always kind of struggled with that phrase. I remember reading this. It was one of Seth Godin's books. I've read, I think, every one of his books. I love him as an author, and he tells this story in one of his books. I think it was Lynchpin, where he's in he's in Mexico with his family on vacation, and he couldn't sleep. It was like 2 a.m., and so he, went down, took his computer, went downstairs, sat in the lobby, and was going through some emails. And he sees this couple come in to like check in to the hotel, and he hears this wife that kind of is talking to her husband and says, "Oh man, I can't believe that guy over there would come all the way to Mexico to just be working in the middle of the night." And Seth Godin says, man, I feel bad for those people that probably work a job for 50 hours a week that they look forward to escaping for 2 weeks out of the year.
Yeah.
And he was like, I'd rather be doing work that in a time where I have downtime that I actually get value from doing it. Like I enjoy it. And so I think it's a different perspective. And I've always really wanted to like enjoy the work we're doing and enjoy the work I'm doing. And I feel like that's super underrated. I'm very much not a like work to play kind of person. Um, and so for me, first off, I've always wanted to really enjoy the work that I'm doing. Um, because I know there's going to be times where I have to work more. I know there's going to be times where work bleeds into my personal life. So I probably haven't had as clear of lines between like work and life. I love talking about what we're doing. I love thinking about work. I love thinking about building things. I am learning to I'm learning and putting in some practices right now to like get better at pulling away from work.
Hmm.
Um, and realizing that even though I get a lot of value and I really like working, that I still need to be really intentional about pulling back. And I'll tell you a quick story because I kind of jumped into this and kind of failed recently at this in an interesting way where I wanted to take a day of solitude where I like pulled back and I did like a solo day.
Yeah.
Um, and so I put it on the calendar. I've wanted to do this for a while and I told my wife about it. And so I took a day and I kind of just wanted to like go through the day how I wanted to go through it and just kind of like not have a super rigid plan. I knew I wanted to get into the mountains. And so I went into the mountains and went snowshoeing for a couple hours by myself and loved getting there. And then, found myself in a coffee shop in Estes reading for a couple hours and then ended up that afternoon like my mind started now that I had given myself some space to breathe. I was starting to think through some of these problems and challenges in business that are like more strategic CEO level problems that I don't get as much time to work on as I think. And so then I ended up finding a place and for a couple hours, like doing some like really good work. I got a ton of stuff done in like a 2 or 3 hour period, and I finished the day and it was like, man, this was great. But I also felt like I was missing something because I was like, this was great, but I was satisfying two totally different. Like I was like, this didn't feel right. It felt like a muscle that like needed to be worked out, or like
Yeah.
a practice that needed to be worked on more. And so as I processed it with my wife and some people around me, I realized I was trying to satisfy two things. Where one, there needs to be really specific time where I am disconnected from my team, like where people can't reach me, where I'm working on very on like strategic work, where I'm working more on the business, not in the business. And so that time needs to be planned out, and I need to have several chunks each month of time to like go into that, if not each week. And so I was like, okay, this is important. And then on the other side, I realized it's really uncomfortable for me to be totally disconnected from technology and to not think about work. And I need to practice that more. And so I
Mm.
also need to have time each month where even though I love work, even though I love what I'm doing, and I recognize there's going to be times where these blend together, I need to start practicing this time where nobody can get a hold of me other than my wife. And I'm not letting myself think about work, even though I like it. I'm not letting myself get stressed about it. I'm not working on work problems. I'm not letting my mind go there. And I think that's going to take practice. I think it's going to take a couple months, um, maybe longer. I don't really know, but it's going to take some consistency. So I'm going to start having time in my schedule to kind of specifically pull back from that. Um, but it's challenge.
Yeah. Early on when I first started this podcast, I had Christy Wright on the podcast, and she wrote a book called Take Back Your Time. And I really like how she um looked at work-life balance differently, because you're right, there is no like work and then there's a line and then life about there is no such thing as that. And I think everyone has a different way of finding that balance. There'll be seasons in life where it might be onboarding a client, right? You're going to need to put some extra hours and you're going to have to do some trade-offs here and there, and realizing that you kind of have to find your own way when it comes to that work-life balance, or even just finding whatever balance works for you.
When I'm a big fan of like the concept of like containers where
Hmm.
I think if we don't have a container for something, then that thing is going to be expressed when it shouldn't be. So if I don't have a container to think about like really strategic work, or if I don't have a container to work on the business and I'm just doing busy work all day, then my brain is going to recognize, well, hey, you still need to be working on the business. And
Yeah.
so then at night and late at night and in conversations with my wife and with friends, my mind is going to be jumping through these bigger challenges and it's going to be working through it. If I don't have friends to talk about what I'm learning in my spiritual life and in my relationship with God, if I don't have if I'm not like talking about those things, then I'm just going to spill it on whoever's around me. Like, and that's kind of how things work is like we need containers and spaces to be able to talk about things. And I've heard people talk about like this illustration of like our brain when we're sleeping, where it's like part of what our brain is doing at night is it's organizing everything from the day. And so it's like taking all the important things that happen in the day and it's kind of putting it into long-term memory and long-term storage. But they said there's like a certain amount of like processing throughout the day that makes it easier for your brain to actually sleep. And so if we give ourselves space during the day for these like little guys in our brain who are doing all the file management, if we give ourselves time during the day for those little guys in our brain to be able to do that, then at time at night, they're actually going to be able to take a break. And then that's when you go into deep sleep, is when your brain can actually rest. But if we don't have that time during the day, we just fill it with all this busy work, and then we never give ourselves these containers and these spaces, then shocker, you might be sleeping at night, but your brain's going to be working on overdrive trying to process everything that happened throughout the day. So that weird little illustration of these little human people or munchkins or whatever they are running around my brain,
Mhm.
putting files and things, it was like, man, that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm trying to get better at having times throughout the day where I don't have an agenda. That might mean I sit there for 20 minutes. That might mean I go on a walk
Yeah.
and I don't listen to podcasts. That might mean I don't listen to music when I'm exercising or something, like these different times throughout the day where I'm letting my brain just be. And
Yeah.
there's no input, there's no output. I'm just letting my brain be. And when I do that, I realize, oh man, I feel a lot more rested. My sleep is better, all this stuff.
Yeah. And sometimes that can be very uncomfortable too.
Oh, it's super uncomfortable. We suck at waiting. Like our culture has kind of like made it so that nobody ever has to wait. And I think it's really, really unhealthy. Like, uh, I think if sitting down for like 30 minutes by yourself with no music, no podcast, no TV, just sitting there by 30 minutes, like if that scares you, then there's like some problems. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it will be comfortable. But like if you're like, oh no, I could never do that, then probably ask yourself why.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, awesome. I wanted to touch on podcasting since you are kind of in the podcasting space as we wrap up this conversation here. Um, I struggled with this as well. There everyone seems to doing a podcast nowadays. There's a podcast for literally everything you can think of today, and a lot of people still want to get into the space. They have this idea that my gosh, like I really have this awesome idea. I want to start a podcast, but really same thing as starting a business, right? They don't really have the courage or confidence to do so. I struggle with this podcast is it took almost 6 to 8 months for me. I was marinating this idea, and I didn't think that there I would be able to provide value, like who would listen and stuff like that. And so why should even one start a podcast?
Well, you shouldn't start it because you want to make money.
Mhm,
Um, I don't think you should start many things. I don't think money should be the motivation for many things.
mhm,
I think money's more of like a metric of value. So it's like I think if you're giving value to if you're creating value, money's going to follow. But a lot of people they see podcasting and they hear that Joe Rogan just signed a multi-hundred million dollar deal, and they hear about all these big spot like podcast deals, and they're like, oh my gosh, I should start a podcast.
yeah.
Those situations are very different than most podcasts.
Mhm,
So I think at the end of the day, you should start a podcast because you feel passionate about a message, and
mhm,
because you feel passionate about building an audience around a specific topic or around helping them in a specific way. So like we walk all of our clients through like a 4-step framework of like things you should understand before you're starting a podcast. The first three of those things are understanding your audience, understanding what challenges or problems they have, and then understanding how your content is going to help them solve those problems. So, with those, like if you don't have an answer to those three things of like who your audience is, what their problems are, how your content is going to help them solve their problems, then you shouldn't start a podcast. At least, particularly from like a like nonfiction business side of things, like the whole fiction, true crime world, great world in podcasting, but it's just a little bit different. Uh,
mhm,
I also want to say, like, the industry is still so young. In the last month, there's been give or take. Well, I'll be generous and say 400,000 podcasts that have published an episode in the last month. There's been over 130 million YouTube channels that have published a video in the last month. So I recognize that comparison is not like it's not like the exact same. Like those are different mediums and different platforms,
Hmm.
but there are that means there's like 1 to 3% of the number of podcasts being published as there are YouTube videos. So
Wow.
the market is still very, very young. It's still very undersaturated. So yes, it is becoming more popular. Also, it takes dramatically a smaller audience to sustain a podcast than it does to sustain like a YouTube channel.
Mm.
Um, YouTubers need millions and millions of views, and if you're trying to monetize through traditional methods, you probably still need hundreds of thousands of downloads a month from a podcaster's perspective. But also, there's so many other ways that you can make money from podcasting. So I think why you should start a podcast is because you have a conviction of something that you want to help people in some specific way. And it's still super, super early for podcasting.
Mm. Well, awesome. Well, as we wrap up, Seth, I do have some rapid fire questions here that we do with every guest just to get to know them a little bit more. So the first question is, how do you consume content and how do you to grow yourself and develop yourself?
Yeah, so I do listen to podcasts. Shocker. So I really like podcasts. I think it's a really great way to learn. So I feel like I enjoy that. I listen to a bunch of different podcasts. Like there's some podcasts I listen to a lot of things through, but I'll pretty regularly go in and just like look through libraries of podcasters that I like and kind of handpick a handful of episodes. And so I don't necessarily have like, man, these are my like ride or die shows.
Yeah,
I'm also always like listening and reviewing quite a bit of content for the shows that we produce and we manage. So I do have to be intentional about going and listening to content that I like because I could spend all my time just reviewing content that we're producing. But I really like podcasting. And then, I mean, I'm a huge fan of books. I think that books are like cheat codes where you have these people that have all of this learned experience over like, they might take everything they've learned in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, maybe even their whole life, and then they'll boil it down into this book.
yeah,
And I just feel like that's like a cheat code. So I really, really like books. I can't read nonfiction books before I go to bed because my brain won't turn off. So in the last 2 years, I've forced myself to start reading fiction books before bed, and that kind of like turns my brain off of working. Is I'm either reading nonfiction books or reading fiction books or watching a show that has nothing to do with work or personal development with my wife or different things like that. So I'm trying to balance it out with some fiction, some nonfiction.
awesome. Dead or alive, who'd you like to have lunch with?
Man, I thought about this question. Um that's so hard because I would almost say I'm this sounds terrible. I'm gonna kind of say like almost anybody. I really believe there's a story and a conversation with anybody. And I think that part of the value of like humans is being able to sit down and like have conversations with each other and learn people's stories.
Yeah.
So um I don't know. I'll maybe say like actually I have a very clear answer. It's probably my grandpa. He died like 15 years ago, and I just never got to say goodbye to him. So there's some family members that's like, man, sure, I'd love to talk to these famous inventors or business owners or different people like that. I could think of a million, but in reality, I think we probably all have somebody close to us that left too early and we didn't get to say goodbye. And so having a conversation with those people would mean a lot.
That's true, yeah. And then what is the next thing that you'd like to do on your bucket list?
Uh Sounds kind of cheesy, but buy not like a new car, but like I've always wanted to buy a Tesla. So I think this year I'm finally gonna pull the plunge and buy a Model Y
Oh,
this
nice.
year. So that's been on my bucket list for a while, and then this year was like I should probably just figure like if I actually want to do it, then I should probably do it.
Yeah. Yep. And then final question, what is the best advice or words of wisdom that you have received so far?
Hmm. I think there's so much good advice. It can't really be boiled down to um, down to one thing. I think of the advice like just to trust myself,
Mm.
uh, not solely. I mean, we have to trust other people, but and I've heard that from many mentors, like along the way, of like this concept of trusting your gut, and as we're leading, as we're growing our business, being willing to trust that. If we've been given a calling to lead a business or to build something, then we have also been given um, direction and insight in that. And we need to be learning, but also recognizing like there's going to be a grace to have to there's going to be a grace internally to be able to trust. Like, okay, I've been I've been entrusted with this mission, with this thing that I want to build. And so there's going to be times where I'm up against the wall and where I need to be willing to just trust my gut.
Well, awesome. Well, Seth, it was great getting to know you more and your story, kind of unpack your story of entrepreneurship and to where your business is today. And thank you so much for your time and being on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Cameron. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to Navigation and Discovery with Cameron Singh. I really hope that this interview with Seth really added value to you and your journey wherever you're at, and that you're able to learn from a mindset of an entrepreneur and how it was, it took some time for him to get to where he needed to get to today, where he is finding his niche in the podcasting world. And so I really hope that this added value to you. If this is your first time listening to Navigation and Discovery with Cameron Singh, feel free to subscribe and so that you receive a notification when the next episode goes live. And also, if you would like to get a copy of my book, Navigation and Discovery, a path of navigating and discovering through your journey of faith, which is really the heart behind this podcast. And you can go on my website, CameronSingh.com, and that link is in the podcast description on whichever platform that you're listening on. And also, if you're looking for these podcast episodes in video format, they are all on YouTube. So you can go on my channel, just go to CameronSingh.com and click on the YouTube link, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. And that's where I'll be posting future videos as well. Thank you again for tuning in to Navigation and Discovery with Cameron Singh. And we'll catch you on the next episode next week. Thank you.